Hey everyone, Forrest here with Rocky Mountain School of Photography, and today we are going to do a deep dive on how to photograph the eclipse. We're going to talk about where to shoot it, what equipment you need, different exposure settings, different image options, how an eclipse works, really a broad strokes overview on the entire process. I also want to say that all of the equipment that I'm mentioning in this video is linked down in the description below, and definitely stick around till the end because I'm going to give you the exact exposure settings that worked for me when I shot the eclipse back in 2017 and that I plan to use again this year. Very important disclaimer, we are going to be talking about pointing our camera at the sun with long lenses. There are a ton of ways that you can seriously permanently damage your camera equipment and permanently damage and blind yourself doing this. So first and foremost, I'm not taking any responsibility for what you do with your camera. However, I'm going to give you some best practices in this video on how to keep yourself safe. But here's what I would do. Before you point your camera at the sun, with any filtration, do your own research. Be sure that what you're doing is backed up by multiple sources and that you're doing things as safely as possible. There is a very safe way to do this, but there's also a lot of ways to really hurt yourself or your camera gear. So do your research. Don't take what I say as the end-all be-all answer. Be responsible, be smart before you point your camera at the sun, particularly with a long lens. Finally, this is going to be a little different. This is more of a lecture style video versus a standard YouTube video. So sit back, relax. We're going to do a deep dive and really help you understand what's involved with photographing this pretty epic event. Let's dive in. So first, let's start with the when and where. This eclipse is going to run through Mexico, the United States, and a little bit of Canada, and it's going to be on April 8th of 2024. The reason I'm doing this video now is it gives us a few months to practice, get equipment, and get the whole idea figured out before it's actually eclipse day. And that's going to be a general theme of this video, is practicing. Now, I do want to point out NASA has created this beautiful map. There's a link in the description to download it and check it out yourself, but this goes into where you can see totality, where you can see a partial eclipse. What that means we'll get into in a second, but basically know that this dark band across the United States is going to be where the best viewing of the eclipse happens. In fact, if you're not in this band, you might not even know that an eclipse is happening. The sun is so bright, and even if it's mostly occluded by the moon, it still almost feels like full daylight. So if you're not in that dark band, I definitely recommend planning a trip to go to that area if you want to get the best experience with the eclipse. So what can we expect to photograph? I have a few example images that I shot back in 2017 that I think are a really good kind of holistic example of what you can expect. This is kind of the image most people think of when they think of a full solar eclipse. This was shot with a 60D, 360mm lens that I cropped in, and I have the settings here as well. I tried to make that a theme throughout this entire video presentation, the different settings that I used in these different situations. So this was taken at totality. This is only possible, this photo is only possible if you are in that dark band on the United States, Canada, or Mexico. This is sometimes called the diamond ring effect. Okay, this as well is only possible inside of that dark band and I guess a little bit outside of it. Another diamond ring example here. This is showing some of those solar prominences, the little red solar flares coming off the outside of the sun. This is a partial eclipse, and you can see very little bit of the sun is covered up by the moon. And we'll talk more about why this all happens here, but this would be an image that you would be capable of getting even if you're not in that dark band, as well as something like this, a partial eclipse, okay? Also, you can play with multiple images and shooting sequences that tell the story of the eclipse from the beginning to the end, and there's also ways to do this in a kind of a wide field way as well. So this is what we're gonna break down today. How does this process work? What's involved? What does it feel like on eclipse day? And what should we be focusing on in order to do it? So I want to start by explaining a little bit about what a solar eclipse is, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there. So basically, a solar eclipse is caused when the sun's light is blocked by the moon. The moon comes in front. It comes between the sun and the earth. And that blocks the light and it casts a shadow on the earth. It's a pretty cool effect. And the area that's in full shadow is called the umbra. That's where that dark band is across the United States. And this is where you can see a total eclipse, a total blocking of the sun. The area in partial shadow is called the penumbra. This is where you can see a partial eclipse. And most of the United States is in a partial eclipse zone. So here's a little diagram kind of showing that. We can see the moon blocking the light from the sun, and that little band in full shadow is the umbra, and then the penumbra is all that extra space around it. So it's pretty easy in a eclipse to be in the penumbra. It's not as exciting, you only get partial coverage, but that umbra, that's the part that's super, super cool and what we've all seen. Now, I do like to kind of tell everybody what's required by the whole situation in order for the sun to fully eclipse. And the first thing is that from a perspective of the viewer, the sun and the moon need to be aligned, okay? So this really only happens at new moon times, and there's got to be a perfect alignment there. Also, the moon needs to be at its closest or near its closest point to the Earth in its orbit, also sometimes known as perigee. Perigee means that the moon is closer to the Earth, which means it appears bigger, and it needs to be closer because in order to block the sun completely, it has to be at its closest point. You guys may remember in 2023, we had an annular eclipse, and an annular eclipse is when everything else works out except the moon is a little bit too far away from Earth, that the best the eclipse gets is a little ring, a little solar ring around the moon. The moon does not completely block the sun's light. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the different types of eclipses. So this is kind of going to be what you can expect to see from where you live. So like I said already, a partial eclipse is viewable through most of the United States, most of Canada, most of this side of the Earth during eclipse time. Basically, the moon is only going to partially cover the sun, and this is what you can expect in that penumbral shadow zone. And like I said, all the United States is going to have something, a partial eclipse on April 8th, assuming that it's clear and you can see the sky, and this is what it's going to look like to a varying degree of success. Now, you're not going to see this without filters. Don't look at the sun, and that's a big disclaimer I'm going to have throughout this video is filtration. There's a lot of ways to damage your eyes, damage your camera equipment without doing this properly. So I want to just say filtration is key, and that's going to be something we get to in the end here that's really important. The second type of eclipse is a total eclipse, and this is the coolest part, okay? This is where the moon completely blocks the sun, and we are able to see this beautiful kind of corona of the sun, the solar atmosphere. It's an amazing time. Those of you who've seen this before, it's an amazing event, even with your eyes. You look up at the sun's not there, it's a black circle, there's like atmosphere. It's an amazing, amazing experience. So again, I want to hammer home, if you can get to that path of totality is what it's called, that dark band through the United States, Canada, and Mexico, do it, because it's really, really, truly one of those experiences that you will never forget for your entire life. You'll be super hyped up about it, and you can get very cool photographs. But in order to get this, in order to feel that whole thing, you have to be in that band, dark band in the United States, Mexico, and Canada, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about how the process works. I think kind of the workflow is important to discuss next. So what we like to say is the sun is just like the sun any other day on eclipse day until the first thing happens. And the first kind of section of an eclipse is what we would call first contact. And first contact is where you can first start to see the moon blocking part of the sun. Okay, it's the first stage of the eclipse. And this is when the moon just begins to occlude the sun or cover the sun. And basically the sun just looks like a part of it is missing. Now, I want to say you do need filtration to safely view first contact. You can't just point your camera up. This is where the filters are on the lens. You're being careful. Here's a quick example of what first contact looks like. We can see here's the sun. It looks like a big orange blob. And in the upper left-hand corner, we have a little bit of the moon covering it up. Note that I do have an ND 100,000 filter on my camera for this picture because I don't want to burn out my sensor or my eyeballs. So there's my settings here and kind of what I used. Also note that I did crop this in quite a bit. The 140mm lens on the X-T2 with a 1.4 extender plus some cropping got me this field of view. So as you watch it, right? And this also means get some goggles for your eyes too, so you can watch this. But you'll watch that sun slowly start to get covered up more by the moon. And that process continues until you hit what's called second contact. Now, second contact is the second stage of the eclipse, and it's when the moon begins to fully occlude the sun. So the sun begins to get fully blocked. This is the start of totality, right? If you're in the path of totality. And This is also where we need proper filtration. Until the sun is completely covered, we have to have filters on our cameras and our eyes to keep everything safe. Now, do note, second contact will not happen unless you are in that predetermined section of the country. Here's an example of what second contact looks like. This is also sometimes called the diamond ring effect. There's lots of different names for it, but again, it's where the moon starts to fully cover the sun. After second contact, we have what's called totality. This is where the coolest part happens. We can see the corona. This is the third stage of the eclipse. The moon is fully blocking the sun, and we're able to see stars. We're able to see the sun's corona. Birds think it's nighttime. It's an amazing, amazing experience. All right, now here's the thing. You do not need filtration for your eyes or your camera to photograph or look at this phase of the eclipse. But be careful, this only lasts a couple minutes. We're talking 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, depending how close to the center of that path of totality you are. As soon as it's over, you gotta put the glasses back on and you gotta put the filter back on your lens. So it's really just for a couple minutes you can remove the lens filter and start shooting and get those totality shots, okay? And like I said, lasts about 2 minutes and 30 seconds depending on how close to the center of that path of totality you're on. Here's an example of an image of totality, right? We can see and notice no filter here. Also, there is a huge, we're gonna talk exposure in a little bit, but there's a huge difference in brightness between the darkest part and the brightest part of the solar atmosphere, the moon, all the different parts of this image. So you'll notice I say bracketed HDR. This is really an important part of the process to bracket your exposure from bright to dark on. Third contact is our fourth stage of the eclipse. It's when all of a sudden the moon has moved past the sun and we're able to start seeing the sun's light again. This is the end of totality. Again, totality lasting there for about 2 minutes, something like that. Okay, again, we need filtration here. And then I'll go quickly. Fourth contact is marking the end of the eclipse. This is where really the eclipse is over and the moon stops occluding the sun. And again, we would need filtration for this and the sun returns to a normal state. Okay, so that's how this works. Really, it's a pretty quick process. I like to think about it as really about 2, 3, 4 hours going from start to finish, from setting up your gear, photographing everything, getting through totality, getting through the end of the eclipse. And if you are interested in getting a shot like this, you do need to shoot for the whole time, right? You want a shot from first contact to fourth contact and everything in between. So you do need to keep your gear set up in order to get those shots that kind of span the duration, but we're talking a few hours here. Now, the next section I want to get into is equipment, and this is pretty important. I do recommend ordering your gear early. I've left links down in the description to kind of my favorite gear, but this stuff was hard to find in 2017, particularly if you waited until the last minute. So, a couple quick discussions here. First is lenses. With lenses, really it's deciding how much cropping you want to have to do. Most of us are probably going to be shooting with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, but I do want to say if you have a telescope or something very long or a 2x teleextender and a 600 millimeter, who knows? I don't know what you all have. If you want just the sun will fill the frame at about 2000 millimeters. That's when you'll have a sun perfectly filling your field of view and you won't have to do any cropping, but you also have enough to get the whole thing in the frame. So anything beyond that, you're going to be taking partial sun photos. Now, when I say 2000 millimeters, I'm talking about effective focal length. So if you put a 200 millimeter lens on a crop sensor camera, I would be calling that a 300 millimeter lens. Effective focal length, not actual focal length. So 2000 millimeter effective focal length is going to be your maximum. If you want the sun and the corona, the cool solar kind of atmosphere, then you're going to want to keep your focal length under 1000. And again, that's effective focal length. So you don't really want to go longer than that. But I do want to say, if all you have is a 70 to 200, that's great. If you can get a 1.4x teleconverter, that will help quite a bit, or even a 2x teleconverter, that's going to help a lot. It's just going to mean that you have to do a little bit of cropping. The longest lens I used for any of the photos in this frame was a 350 millimeter. So I wasn't like coming in super close. It was a 350 millimeter lens with a crop sensor camera and a little bit of cropping, and happy day, it all works out. I do want to say though that a telescope is a very cheap way to get longer focal length. So if that's something you're interested in, do look at some telescope reviews out there. Telescopes are also great for nighttime astrophotography, so they can be a good investment investment into this genre of photography of pointing your camera up to the sky, and they're a lot cheaper per millimeter of focal length than a lens. I do want to point out Fred Espenak, also known as Mr. Eclipse, MrEclipse.com. He has created quite the database of information on eclipses. He's photographed many eclipses through the years, and he made this chart that I think is really useful to kind of see how focal length affects the field of view around the sun. So definitely check out his website. He has a lot of great information that dives a little deeper into this. I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Now I want to talk a little bit about cameras. So I actually don't think this matters too much. Really, any mirrorless or DSLR camera is going to do a really nice job. Because focal length is important though, you might consider a crop sensor camera or a very high megapixel full frame camera that you can then crop in post-production. That's totally fine as well. There's going to be a lot of available light here. We're not really pushing the limits of our cameras. Even with these filters, we have a ton of light. So high ISO performance is not going to be as important. Even if you have a slightly older camera, it's going to be able to do a great job in this situation. I would almost recommend bringing a few cameras too, so you can get some wide shots, some medium shots, some tight shots of this event. And who cares how old the camera is, you're still going to have multiple cameras to cover such a cool thing. The biggest thing I can say is get a camera or use a camera that you're comfortable with. Particularly during totality, it's a very stressful event. It can be. So take your time, use a camera that you know backwards and forwards so that when you're changing settings very quickly, you've already know what to expect. Also, I can say practice this stuff. We can practice ahead of time. The sun's going to be no different now than it is on eclipse day, except for totality. That's kind of the event that's different. But first contact, second contact, third contact, and fourth contact, the sun's the same brightness through all of those phases of the eclipse as it will be today, if it's a clear day that you're watching this. So just keep that in mind. You can practice this stuff ahead of time. And honestly, I would. Like I said, there's a lot of stress that can go into this situation. And my goal when I was shooting in 2017, and if I can make it out to shoot this year, is going to be to enjoy the eclipse. I don't want to be worrying about my camera equipment. All right, let's talk the most important thing, solar filters, okay? If you're going to photograph any stage of the eclipse except for totality, you need a solar filter, okay? Once you get the filter, you can actually use it to photograph the sun any old day. You don't have to just use it for an eclipse. So it's actually a good investment. There's sometimes sunspots, prominences, cool things on the sun, and it's nice to be able to take images of those. Most solar filters can be had for between about $50, even cheaper than that for some, up to about $150. There's also some filters that can do narrow band imaging of the sun, and those cost well over $1,000, but they can also be had for very cool, unique images. There are also dedicated telescopes that do a lot of the filtration for you and can provide very unique views of the sun. This is not something that I'm a particular expert in, nor have I done except for once or twice, so I'm definitely not the resource there, but if you look up solar photography on YouTube, you're going to find tons of people who do this on a day-to-day basis, not just during eclipse time, and they can really explain this gear and how to do that process. So if that interests you, it might make sense to buy a more expensive filter that's capable of doing that because you can use it after the fact, even not just for eclipse day. The final thing that I want to say is don't forget to buy goggles for your eyes. This is so important. You want to be able to see it with your eyes as well. Even just working on your camera, aiming your camera, looking up to the sky, you want to keep your eyes safe. I believe B&H has solar goggles for sale for about $10-15 for a pack of 5. They're very affordable. So get yourself a set of goggles, have those with you. Do be very careful with them. Those goggles and some of the filters are made of what's called mylar, which is a very delicate material, and even a little pinprick hole can let a lot of light in and can damage your eyes or damage your camera. So do be really careful, treat these filters very delicately. Remember, they are the only thing between your eyes and the sun, and that can cause a lot of damage. So there's two real types of solar filters. We have visible light filters and hydrogen alpha filters. So visible light filters are going to let you take photos like this. You can see the sun, it kind of looks like a giant orange, right? The fruit, we've got some sunspots on it. And all it's doing is it's blocking about 16 stops of light from getting to your sensor. Visible light filters basically allow all of the light to come through. It just dims it all down by 16 stops, which is a lot, but it's just light blocking. That's all it's really doing. They work perfectly, but they don't really provide that interesting of a view. You compare this to what's called a hydrogen alpha filter, and hydrogen alpha filters block a lot of light except for very specific wavelengths, very specific colors of light. And these allow you to see more surface detail on the sun, more prominence detail, a lot more interesting information. And like I said, there are hydrogen alpha telescopes as well that the filtration is built into the telescope, not into a filter. So it makes it a little bit easier to fit things out, get a little bit better image quality, so on and so forth. These are more of a long-term investment, like I said, that can be used for years to come to photograph surface details on the sun. Before investing in one of these, I would definitely look at what's involved, the learning curve with using one. Like I said, I've owned one before, I've used it a couple times, but it wasn't something that I really saw the time investment value in. It wasn't a hobby I wanted to get into, but there's some people out there who do amazing jobs with these filters. Again, here's a side-by-side comparison. You can see on the left, visible light, kind of just seeing some darker spots. And then in hydrogen alpha, we're seeing a lot more surface detail. So let's get to the specifics. The basic filter I would recommend most of you buy to shoot the eclipse would be a simple Mylar solar film filter, okay? This is the simplest and cheapest option. They cost about $15 to $20. They're made of Mylar, and it's not going to be as durable or last quite as long. You're probably only going to get one eclipse out of it, a couple shoots out of it, but they're real simple. They're actually made of cardboard, most of them. All you do is take a ruler, measure the size, the diameter of the front of your lens, and you get a size that will fit over your lens. It doesn't have to be perfect. The Mylar film actually will have some kind of like waviness to it. It's not going to affect your image quality. It's just the way that Mylar works. And again, like I said, they're only about $20. So I really recommend, even if you're not going to travel to the path of totality, it's still a cool thing to be able to take a picture of the sun with it covered up by the moon, even partially. So I would definitely invest in one of these for $15 to $20, just so on an eclipse day you can have a cool experience and get to take a cool photo that you can't take any other time. Stepping up to the intermediate level, we have a glass ND filter. Now, glass ND filters, I want to make something very clear, are not for visual use. You do not want to use these and then look through an optical viewfinder. So if you have a DSLR and you want to look through your viewfinder on your DSLR, buy yourself a Mylar filter, not a glass ND filter. Glass ND filters are fine for photographic use, but with your eyes, they don't provide necessary protection. What you're looking for is an ND 100,000 or a 16-stop ND filter. That's the recommended density to protect your gear. Some people like to ask me, well, what about if I stack a bunch of other ND filters together? And you can definitely do that, but just remember, every filter you stack is another layer of glass you're shooting through, so you're gonna reduce your sharpness, your contrast, and your overall image quality. These are a lot more durable, however, than a Mylar filter, and the image quality is generally going to be a little bit better. So if you are looking for more of a long-term investment filter, this can be good. The other nice thing about an ND 100,000 filter is it's good for just general purpose work. If you're in a bright sunny day and you want to get a very long exposure of a waterfall or of the ocean, things like that, this can be a great way to do it. So even for daytime work, just like terrestrial photography, these can be a good investment. Generally, these are about $100 to $125. Again, I've provided a link in the description to one that I recommend. Finally, we get to the professional hydrogen alpha filters. And I'm not going to go too in-depth on these, but if you are looking to really get into it, this would be the most advanced way to shoot the eclipse. However, these come with their own quirks and features. Don't buy one of these, get it delivered the day before the eclipse, and expect to use it during the eclipse. They're just not built for that. Honestly, these are better, I think, for non-eclipse situations, but they can be used for the eclipse as well. This is going to give you the best view. It's going to show you the most detail on the sun, all of that. But again, when totality rolls around, you're actually going to take the filter off, and these are kind of a pain to take off. So all little things to consider. These also cost over $1,000. All right, I want to remind you, you do not need a filter to shoot images like these four. None of these four images were filtered. Now the two top ones, those are diamond ring. That's where the sun is just starting to peek out behind the moon. At that moment, I shot a few shots and immediately put the filter back on the camera because those are kind of on the verge, right? You're starting to get some sunlight directly into your lens. So you want to be a little bit cautious there, but none of the 4 of these had solar filtration on them. Another thing you may want to consider purchasing for the Eclipse would be a tracking mount of some kind. Now, astrophotographers, you probably already have one. Great, use it. It's awesome to use for the Eclipse. Basically, what it's going to happen is the sun is going to be moving, and if you don't have a tracking mount, you're going to point your camera at the sun and very quickly the sun is going to move out of the frame. You're going to lose it there. So what this tracker does is it's going to take care of this for you. It's going to keep the sun centered in your camera throughout the duration of the eclipse. Now, trackers are aligned to the North Celestial Pole in the Northern Hemisphere, which is called the North Star or Polaris. So what I actually did was in 2017, I set up my tracker the night before. I pointed it at the North Star. I turned it all off and I let it sit until the morning. In the morning, I put my camera gear on it. I turned it on and boom, it was aligned at the North Star that we couldn't see anymore because it's daytime. So that's a way to do it. You also can get your tracking mount just aligned roughly north, pointed at the right degree height of the North Star, and you'll be close. It's going to be close enough. It's going to help a lot compared to manually moving your camera all the time, but this can be a great way to make your life a little bit easier, not have to worry as much about things on eclipse day. And like I said, these are also great for astrophotography. So if you are into shooting galaxies, nebulae, things like that, this is a great investment long-term too. A couple that I recommend, the basic option would be the iOptron Sky Guider EQ. This is a fantastic little mount. Provides some basic tracking, and this is actually what I used in 2017. It worked perfectly, and the only really kind of disadvantage of this is if you are going to use it for astrophotography, it does have a limited payload capacity. It can't hold a big heavy rig. Definitely check the spec sheet on your own to see whether you think your rig will work. It also doesn't have what's called go-to functionality. Go-to means on more advanced mounts you can kind of key in, like go to whatever object like the sun, and it will actually point it at the sun for you. So it's a nice convenience feature. This does not have that, but it's only about $400, and for $400, the performance and the ease of use it's going to give you and ability to grow into astrophotography is pretty cool. One step up from that would be the Skywatcher Star Adventurer GTI. This is going to do the same thing, except it does have go-to and it can handle a slightly heavier rig. So this would be like a long-term investment. If you were really going to get into solar photography and or astrophotography, this would be a good place to start. It's phenomenal. This one does cost $600, however, so you are making more of an investment. One other piece of equipment that I want to mention is a cable release or an interval timer. With filtration on, and particularly during totality, our exposure and our shutter speed is going to be fairly slow. So one thing you're going to want to be able to do is fire your camera without pushing the shutter button. So I would definitely have a cable release or self timer to remotely trigger your camera. Wireless or wired is great, just some way to push a button not on your shutter and not introduce shake into the camera system. All right, let's talk about exposure. Now, this is going to be a little bit challenging, and I want to tell you what I'm going to give you today are guidelines. So definitely check your own histogram, check your own exposure on eclipse day, practice ahead of time, but here's what worked for me. Here are a few notes. Number one, this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. I think really everything else in the eclipse and shooting it is fairly straightforward. Exposure though, if you mess it up, you can get photos that literally don't work. So really try to get it perfect. Next thing is practice ahead of time. Like I said, first contact, second contact, third contact, and fourth contact are all gonna be the same exposure as today. If you go outside and you look at the sun, the exposure will be the same today as it is through first, second, third, and fourth contact. So practice ahead of time. Also remember that totality is going to differ greatly from first contact. So first, second, third, fourth contact versus totality are completely different ball games. Totality is its own special thing. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I also want to point out that the corona's brightness, the corona's like the cool atmosphere of the sun that you see in totality shots, is 1,000,000 times darker than the surface of the sun itself. So we need to do a lot of exposure and filtration adjustments to go from third contact and second contact into that totality mode. Another recommendation I want to give is turning on auto bracketing through everything. Bracketing is where you can tell your camera to shoot 3 stops under, perfect, and 3 stops overexposed every time you hit the shutter button once. It's a safety net. I would really recommend doing it unless you know your exposures are perfect, but there's not really a downside to auto bracketing in situations like this. You know you want to get the shot, you know you have your exposure close, but I figure might as well take an extra shot on either side, a little brighter and a little darker, just to be safe. Now I'm going to separate my exposure recommendations between filtered and unfiltered exposures. So let's go ahead and dive into that. So with a filter, we're talking about shooting from first contact to second contact and third contact to fourth contact. My filtered exposure, and again, this is assuming using a Mylar filter or an ND 100,000 filter, also known as a 16-stop ND filter, my go-to exposure was f5.6 at 1/1000th of a second at ISO 200. Now again, test it yourself, but this worked for me in 2017 and it was pretty consistent across multiple filters and multiple cameras. Now do remember, if you want to go to f8, feel free, just adjust another setting to compensate. So maybe go to ISO 200 or 1/500th of a second. Again, practice your filtered exposures ahead of time because you can. No filtered shots are going to be totality and diamond ring. Okay, again, don't push diamond ring too long in either direction. Make sure you get that filter on quickly, but you can take a couple shots when the sun just starts to peek out. This is going to be where we have bracketing on. My darkest exposure that I used, again, this is no filter on the camera, the darkest that I needed to go, and this was dark enough to get detail in all the parts of the sun around where the moon was covering it up. I went down to f5.6 at 1/8000th of a second at ISO 800. Now again, any variety of that'll work fine. You go to ISO 400 at 1/4000th of a second. Any variety of this is fine, but this was as dark as I needed to go to get detail in the brightest parts of totality. The brightest I went, and this is really important because you want to get all that solar atmosphere, all of the corona, was f5.6 1/8th of a second at ISO 800. So the reason I chose ISO 800 was so that at the brightest, my shutter speed didn't get too slow. If I had shot this whole sequence at ISO 100 at the brightest, I would have been at a really, really slow shutter speed and running the risk of blur. What I decided to do here was I wanted to leave my ISO consistent from the darkest image to the brightest image. So I picked ISO 800 because that allowed me to, at my brightest, I still had 1/8th of a second, which is a fast enough shutter speed to stop a little bit of motion blur. If I wanted to do this whole thing at ISO 100, it would have made my brightest exposure have a really, really, really slow shutter speed, and I would have been worried about the sun moving during the exposure or shaking the camera or something like that. So this is what worked for me. Again, totality you can't really practice ahead of time, but the other one you can. Now I want to point something out. During totality, when I say bracketing, I took a picture at every single exposure, one-stop increments, all the way from my brightest to my darkest. And what I was doing is I was looking at the histogram on the camera, and I was ensuring that at my brightest, I wasn't clipping, didn't lose any detail in the darkest areas of the photo, and at my darkest, I wasn't losing detail in the brightest areas of my photo. I kept going each direction until I was sure there was no clipping happening, and then I knew I was safe and good to go. And I think I ran through the entire run of exposures 2 times during totality just to be absolutely sure that I got good exposures. That also allowed me in the editing to take all those images and composite them together into a final totality shot where we see all of the detail and all of the information. So I do want to point out again on this photo, I say bracketed HDR. This really was heavily bracketed, again, from 1/8th of a second to 1/8000th of a second, all during that 2-minute time frame of totality. The only other thing that I want to say is don't forget to just sit back and look up. Truly just enjoy this moment. It is a really cool thing, and I think a lot of times we get really engrossed as photographers in the gear and getting the shot, and really do sit back and relax and enjoy this for a minute. The other thing that I want to say is I actually ran practice drills doing exactly this process ahead of time to make sure that I had it down. I would even run drills like, okay, here we go. Diamond ring is happening. Second contact just occurred. Okay, filter off. Adjust exposure to my slowest shutter speed. Click, adjust to stop, click, adjust to stop, click, adjust to stop, click. Run through the whole process. Okay, diamond ring's happening again. The moon has moved to the other side of the sun. Filter on, back to normal. Let's keep shooting. And it really helped day of eclipse to kind of have run through that process, know my workflow, obviously be ready for little things to come down the line that I probably don't expect, but it was a pretty seamless process and it worked out pretty well because I had run so many examples. All right, everyone, I hope you liked this video. I hope it provided a good overview of the eclipse and what to expect, what to buy, how to set your camera, all of that kind of stuff. I do want to remind you there are links in the description to all of the equipment that I listed and talked about in this video, as well as some other useful resources, so check it out down there. Also, help each other. If you guys have questions, comments, whatever they are, leave them in the comment section down below. I will be monitoring those as well. So if you have a question or anything comes up, leave it down there and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Lastly, hit subscribe to stay up to date with future videos. We would love to have you as a subscriber, and drop a like down below if you found some value in this. Thanks everybody, and I'll catch you in the next one. Woo! Let's go!